The next important step is the bass drum pedal. So you'll notice that on the bass drum pedal we have this little spring here on the side. Now the spring is something that we can adjust to adjust the tension. If we have a tight spring, that's going to pull that beater back really sharply. If you have a loose spring, it's going to be pushed down by our foot and not tend to recoil as fast. I tend to have the spring pretty tight. There's all sorts of other adjustments you can do there, but basically by tightening or loosening this little knob at the bottom of the spring, that's how you adjust the tension on that to get the beater either springing back hard or having it looser. And then there's a little knob underneath the pedal, okay? So if there's the pedal, we're looking at it from the side, there's a little screw here. And that's what you screw the pedal actually onto the lip of the bass drum with. So undo it a little bit, and then you'll see this little clamp has to go over the bottom rim of the bass drum. So I'll slide that in here. Now, sometimes you might find that when I try and tighten this up, it doesn't go all the way and it's still a little bit loose. This one's okay actually, so I can just tighten up that screw until it's fairly firm, and then you'll find the bass drum pedal stays on quite nicely. Okay, see I can hit that and it's not sliding around. If it doesn't tighten on properly, you might get a little rubber pad to sit underneath that clamp and fill up the gap a little bit more. It also protects your rim. One thing that is worth noting about the position of the bass drum screw, when you do it up, there's a fair bit of adjustment. What you really want is you really want that screw to be in that position. Okay, can you see it in there? It's pretty tough to see. But what you don't want is you don't want that screw to be like that, because then this bit tends to hit the pedal because it's sticking out a little bit. You want the screw to be like that. Not like that, but like that. So it's kind of horizontal. Alright, you can see it in there. It's horizontal, and that's going to mean that when you push the pedal down, it doesn't touch that thing and get a bit of a click sound as the bottom of the pedal hits the metal. There we go. So there's your bass drum pedal ready to go. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get the stool in position. Here's my drum stool. Basically it's got to be back here, and we want it slightly, from my perspective as the drummer, I want the bass drum to be slightly on my right, because that's where my right foot's going to go, on that pedal. So this is kind of what it should look like, and you'll notice that I'm basically adjusting the position of the stool so that as I sit normally like this, my leg's at about 90 degrees, and if I'm sitting comfortably on the stool, my leg should be pointing straight into the drum, my foot should sit naturally on the pedal, and my other leg's kind of out to the other side. But that's a really natural position. The distance of the stool is such that my leg is just pointing in towards the drum, and it's about 90 degrees bend. Okay, so our next job is to get the snare drum in position. First of all, let's have a little look at the snare drum. Okay, so here's my snare drum stand. You'll notice at the base here, I've got these, I've adjusted this so I don't want it up there, or I don't really want it all the way out either. I want that tripod to be at about 45 degrees. There it is, 45-degree tripod. And here's a height adjustment, and this claw is what actually grips onto the snare drum. So there's a little screw here, and I've undone that a fair way so that this claw is wide enough for me to put the snare drum in. Now, as I put it in, I need to make sure of a few things. I need to make sure that all of these 3 points around here, that one here, doesn't really clamp up against any one of these lugs here. Even more important is to make sure that it doesn't interfere with the snare lever here, or the other side of the snare where the tape is being held right there. If it interferes with that, we're going to be in trouble. The claw is actually going to prevent us from adjusting that snare later. So we want all of these things, all of these little rubber clamp corners, to not really be touching anything but the rim of the drum. Once we've done that, we're going to tighten up this screw here, okay, and we're going to do that until those claws come right in and hold the drum fairly firmly. Some people think that you're going to get a better sound if you don't have it too tight, have it just sitting fairly loose so it doesn't sort of clamp onto the bottom rim and let it ring a bit more freely, and that's probably a fair point. I don't worry too much, just get it so that you can't really pull the drum off the stand. That's all kind of one unit now, okay? So now I'm going to get the snare drum and put it in position. One other thing I'd like to just go through quickly on the snare drum is that you'll notice there's a lever on the side which adjusts the snare. Okay, here it is. There's a couple of different sorts of lever. This one is the sort that pulls away like that. When I push in, that brings the snares on. When I pull it away like that, that takes the snares off. There's also a little screw here. There it is. And if I turn that clockwise, it tightens up the snares so they're a bit more snug against the bottom skin. If I loosen it, it lets them come away. I want to adjust that screw so that basically the snares are up fairly snug when the lever's on, and also make sure that when I turn the lever off, that screw is loose enough that the snares aren't actually still touching the bottom skin and creating a sound. So we get a complete full snares off sound, but when I put the lever on, okay, I get a relatively decent sound. Okay, so now that we've got the snare drum, we're going to put it in position. Notice that I'm getting it such that the angle of the drum is probably just a little bit pointing towards the drummer. Here's the drummer right here. The drummer is pointing slightly towards us. Not too much though, we don't want that sort of angle, okay, a really steep angle of the snare drum. We don't really want it perfectly flat either, but just a tiny, tiny bit of angle. Not too much, just a tiny bit of angle. One other thing that we'll go through with the snare drum is the position of the legs. We'll get the camera in and get a closer look. Okay, so let's have a look at the legs position here. This leg is kind of on an angle of about 45 degrees pointing away from the bass drum, and that's because our next job is to put the hi-hat in position. Now, if you're playing a show and the hi-hat's a bit like the bass drum, it tends to slide away from you. So one little trick we can do is to make sure the one leg of the hi-hat sits behind the leg of the snare drum, and that'll tend to help keep it in place. If you put it on this side of the leg, on the back edge, that hi-hat has the ability to keep sliding further and further away. But if you make sure that leg is on this side, it won't be able to slide so far away from you. So let's get that in position now. Here it is, hi-hat on that side. We don't want it on that side. Okay, so that side. And we want that pedal to be facing kind of towards the stool as well, which we'll get back into position in a minute. The next job is to actually sit down and to get some fine adjustment on the position of those pedals so that as we sit, the legs are facing naturally. Okay, so here we have it. We've got our legs now so that we're pointing pretty much directly into the bass drum, and the other leg is pointing directly out towards the hi-hat there. And let's have a look at the height of the hi-hat. There's two things you can adjust on the hi-hat. This knob here adjusts the height of the top cymbal. I'll take that off for a minute. There's another knob down here, you can see that, and with that I can adjust the height of the whole cymbal. This would be probably a little bit too low. It's right down next to the height of the snare drum. I don't want that too low because if I do that, the other hand can't get underneath it. Okay, but I don't want it right up here either because then there's a long way to travel up there. So I'd like to think about a hand's height, the bottom cymbal above the snare drum, maybe a little bit less, maybe just by knuckles. Depends on your sort of action that you use. So there's the height of the bottom cymbal. Pop the top cymbal on top. Okay, and we want I'll push my foot down on the pedal till this is pretty much as far down as it can go. Don't screw it up then. What we want to do is we want to just let that foot come up at least a fraction and then tighten it. That way you can get a pretty good gap here with the cymbals, but when you put your foot down you can get them really tight. Okay, that's really important. There's also under here, and I'll get this in a bit closer so you can see. Okay, right there, there's a little screw. What this screw does is adjust the angle of the bottom cymbal. I don't want that to be perfectly flat. I want to tilt that washer just a fraction, get it in even closer, angle that bottom cymbal a bit so that when the cymbals close, one end or one side closes slightly before the other, and we don't get an airlock between the two cymbals. Okay, that makes a much nicer splashy sound when they close as well. Okay, so